Greetings. Our names are Peter.
And Christy.
It's a joy to join you here virtually. Our home leave from Zanzibar was hastened by the pandemic, but one positive outcome is that it's given us some opportunities to connect with people in the U.S. Even more than we would have under normal circumstances.
We're happy to see how you all are doing community during this time, caring for each other and yourselves and your community and neighbors.
Our thoughts go often to our friends in Tanzania, many of whom are suffering because of the impact of this virus. Some are cut off from seeing family, some have lost loved ones, lost jobs and income. In a crisis like this, it's the poor countries and the poor people within societies that are hit the hardest.
Our economic privilege was evident as we were able to leave the country early and quarantine in a cabin and continue social distancing. Many of our friends have no such options. So we're both thanking God for a good departure and good farewells in Zanzibar and asking God for the deliverance of our Tanzanian friends from the really tough situations they find themselves in. Deliverance is a good word here. We need deliverance in all kinds of ways. From the scourge of a debilitating and deadly virus and all of its effects in our lives, deliverance from the deep wounds of racial injustice in this country from hundreds of years ago into the present, and deliverance from the divisions in our families and societies, in our churches and in our own spirits. Jesus told us to seek first the reign of God and its righteousness. We live our lives in this tension of seeking for the reign of God that is already here, but not yet fully realized. In this plane of existence, the two always go together, like wheat and weeds. You cannot have hope without lament and grief, and you cannot grieve unless you have hope. So it is only right that we lament the not yet parts of our life that are all around us. Social distancing is a lament and a hope. Black Lives Matter is a lament and a hope. Working at relationships between Muslims and Christians is a lament and a hope. Delivering babies in places with few resources is a lament and a hope.
We also have a word for where these two, lament and hope, come together. And that word is prophetic. In that sense, we seek to be a prophetic church, to live our communal calling at that intersection of lament and hope. And there are other prophetic communities as well, and I'm sure some of them come to mind for you. Perhaps your job that brings you into justice work with others, perhaps protests in the streets, or the hard work of relating to marginalized people. This is prophetic work. And those individuals who have dug more deeply into both lament and hope, we sometimes call prophets. Our firstborn was named for one such person who's recognized by both Christians and Muslims. Moses in English, Musa in Arabic and Swahili. For our Zanzibari neighbors, Musa falls into the special category of prophets who were given revelations in the form of books. He's venerated in Islam, Christianity, Judaism, and other related faiths.
But what a gift we have that Moses does not just show up on the scene, ready to deliver God's people from slavery and oppression. Instead, we are given a rich and detailed story, full of mistakes, hesitance, over and underconfidence, and even murder. I like how the Believer's Church Bible commentary entitles the second chapter of Exodus. The title in the commentary is The Salvation of Moses. Now, we often think of Moses being saved from the slaughter of the Hebrew babies by being placed in a basket on the river and rescued by Pharaoh's daughter. But this is only the first part of chapter 2. The rest of the chapter sees Moses encountering an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, and in a rage, he kills the Egyptian. He thinks that what he has done is a secret, but discovers it's not when another Hebrew asks him sarcastically, "Are you going to kill me just like you did the Egyptian? Who made you a ruler or judge over us?" So Moses flees to Midian, where he marries and he has a son and names him Gershom, meaning I have become an alien in a foreign land. He is there a long time and is changed. Something happens to Moses during this time, and we can only describe it as the salvation of Moses, part 2. The first salvation was from the destruction of his life by an oppressive ruler. The second salvation was from the destruction of his life by his own privilege and power as part of the ruling class in Egypt. What kind of salvation do we need? The first or the second? There are those among us and around us who are crying out for the first salvation, whose bodies and lives are being threatened by oppressive systems. This is the resounding cry of Black Lives Matter. Deliver us from destruction, as Moses was delivered from a ruthless Pharaoh.
But many of us find ourselves in need of the second kind of salvation in this story. Salvation from our own privilege. Parker Palmer tells the story of an 18th century Quaker named John Woolman, who received a revelation from God that slavery was an abomination and that the Quakers should set all of their slaves free. And Woolman worked tirelessly to convince his neighbors, some of whose farms and businesses benefited from slave labor, that they should do the right thing in recognizing that of God in every person. And after 2 decades of traveling from town to town, from farm to farm, preaching abolition, Woolman's ideas finally won over the Quakers, who reached a consensus to free all of their slaves and in turn became a leading force in abolition on both sides of the Atlantic 80 years before the Civil War. Quakers also helped to develop the Underground Railroad. It's a wonderful story in some ways and demonstrates the power of one person standing in the tragic gap between what is and what should be. But why did it take so long? Palmer shares a Quaker quip that could apply just as well to Mennonites. We came to this country to do good and ended up doing well. How quickly does our allegiance to the God of Moses and Jesus become softened by wealth and privilege?
It is in the desert, as a stranger in a strange land, that Moses unlearns the ways of Pharaoh. In isolation and retreat, Moses can finally hear God's voice calling him out of his failure and shame. Growing up in Pharaoh's court, Moses may have thought that he could bring justice for his people through power and violence. And yet it is in failure and retreat that Moses finally encounters the delivering power of God. Moses' experience rings true for many of us today. Some of us are filled with passionate rage as we witness the brutal injustices inflicted on those around us. Some of us are realizing for the first time that we are the ones who grew up in Pharaoh's palace, and there is so much to unlearn. Many of us may feel like we have tried and failed and fled in retreat. Perhaps some of us are in the desert, waiting to hear from God. 4 years ago, I found myself fleeing to the desert, not unlike Moses. I had gone overseas to serve God and help save lives with my nursing skills. And it was not long before I realized how terribly unprepared I was for the challenges that I faced. Over the months, my naive enthusiasm slowly turned to burnout, with one failed resuscitation after another. There were times when I knew I was doing the right thing, and other times where I was forced to make decisions that I was unequipped to make. On my worst days, I would ask mothers if they wanted to hold their babies one last time, wondering if maybe I had contributed to their death. I began to dread going to work and found myself wondering what would happen if I drove my car off the terrible potholed road into one of those ditches. Like Moses, I finally retreated out of a need to survive. For 2 months, I stopped going to the hospital. With my body in one of the most beautiful tropical islands in the world, my soul walked through the desert. Like Moses, I was a stranger in a strange land, and now I was also a failure. There are no easy answers in the desert, and for me, there was no burning bush. But what I have encountered time and time again is God's gracious embrace. Like Moses, there's a lot I have had to unlearn about my illusions of saving the world. But also, like Moses, God delivers me from my inadequacies and my shame. And God keeps graciously calling me back to be a part of God's delivering work. In the words of Richard Rohr, we thought we came to God by doing it right. And lo and behold, surprise of surprises, we come to God by doing it wrong and growing because of it. The only things strong enough to break open our hearts are things like pain, mistakes, unjust suffering, tragedy, failure. I wish it were not so, but it clearly is. Fortunately, life will lead us to the edge of our own resources through such events. We must be led to an experience or situation that we cannot fix or control or understand. That's where faith begins. Up to that moment, it has just been religion.
When Moses returns after a long time in the desert to the work of fighting injustice, he humbly seeks a new identity. Who am I? Part of this identity is that he's no longer going rogue to do the thing on his own, the hero who takes the situation into his own hands. God tells him to assemble the elders. But another way to describe what has happened with Moses is that he's learned to live in the space between lament and hope, the hard reality and the promised future. Parker Palmer calls this the tragic gap. He writes, the insight at the heart of nonviolence is that we live in a tragic gap, a gap between the way things are and the way we know they might be. It is a gap that never has been and never will be closed. If we want to live nonviolent lives, we must learn to stand in the tragic gap, faithfully holding the tension between reality and possibility, in hopes of being open to a third way. Learning to live in this prophetic space, the third way that's neither fight nor flight, is what it means to be prophetic. It's what it means to follow in the steps of Moses and Sarah and Abraham and Jesus. But it's difficult and heartbreaking. And this is why we should not ignore the role that heartbreak has in our connection to God and in a life of discipleship. When we see the violence against George Floyd and others, the violence of mass incarceration and systemic oppression, the violence of interfaith hostility, and the violence of poverty and all of its fruit, when we see these things, it's only right that our hearts should break. We learn from Moses and from Exodus that this heartbreak is not the opposite of faith. It's a prerequisite to faith. It's our only way to connect to a God who is compassion in its purest form. An old Hasidic story tells of a student who comes to the rabbi and asks, "Why does the Torah tell us to place these words upon your hearts? Why doesn't it tell us to place these words in our hearts?" The rabbi answered, "It's because as we are now, our hearts are closed, and we cannot place the holy words in our hearts. So we place them on top of our hearts, and there they stay until one day the heart breaks and the words fall in." May we be the kind of fertile ground where the words fall in like seeds and grow.
May God bless you and sustain you in this time of lament and hope.